2023 is finally over, and so it's time for my favorite video of the year, ranking the best and worst games that released. Now, as much as I am a cynic when it comes to the gaming industry, I have to admit this year has been better than the last 5. Certainly not one of the greatest years in gaming history, as I've seen quite a few people claim. But I'd be lying to you if I didn't say I had fun with about 10 games I played this year, which is certainly nothing to scoff at. I think this is the first year in a long time that I legitimately played more good games than bad, but I played more than enough mediocre slop, a depressing amount. But thankfully today we're not here to talk about mediocrity, only the absolute best and worst for this list. And I don't think I should have to say this, but obviously this is a completely subjective list. There is no metric for what makes the best or worst game. They're just the games I liked or hated the most. If you've seen any of my other best and worst lists, you know I like to slip at least one game on the worst list that is not objectively bad. So don't worry, I'm already ready for the angry comments. So to go over the rules really quick, it's pretty much the same as last year. First of all, no graphical remakes, but reimaginings are allowed. That means the Resident Evil 4 remake is absolutely valid for this list. More than enough elements of the game were changed for it to qualify as a reimagining. Second rule is no early access games. I almost made an exception for Lethal Company, but at the end of the day, it's a flavor of the month co-op game, so who knows if it'll actually end up being good when it fully releases. And my final rule, which should go for any list really, I have to have actually played the game. So there were 2 or 3 major terrible games I never got around to playing, which was on purpose to preserve my own sanity. So because I know my audience, as always, we will begin with the 5 worst games of 2023.
To be more precise, we siphon it to use as we will, and it stays here. But it's not meant to. And no one's ever discovered how to actually put it back. All that magic over all that time. And so the wound grows.
Guys, it's like climate change, dude. We gotta use fossil fuels to power all of society, and it's killing the planet.
This secret sucks. That's insane.
What? And we're starting off with a game that I guarantee the vast majority of you forgot even came out, Immortals of Avium. EA's new IP, an actual single-player game from the people who claimed single-player games were dead. And it sucked absolute ass. You're probably going to hear me say this a few times during this video, but I can't describe this game as anything other than GOTY slop. This is generic, safe garbage for the masses. Despite being an FPS about magic, the magic is quite literally just guns. Red magic is a shotgun, green magic is a submachine gun, and blue magic is a rifle. And that's pretty much all you get. There's slight variations on those concepts, but it's basically just the same 3 guns you're using. The only thing you do to spice up the gameplay is they give you some special abilities like shooting a bunch of missiles, but it's nothing even slightly creative. This is magic in name only. They're guns, dude. Well, what about the story and the characters? Well, yeah, that's dog shit too, without a doubt. All you gotta do is look these fucking character designs and you can guess exactly what the dialogue is like. And the story is another generic climate change metaphor. Oh, using up magic kills the planet like fossil fuels. The only slight twist on it is humans inadvertently killed off the race that heals magic in the world, and they're these purple alien dudes who act black.
God damn. You've been to the Shrouded Realm again.
And of course the villain is a straight white male, your team is a diversity squad, one of your buddies being the ugliest and second most absurd Abby lookalike I've ever seen in a modern game. With the only one worse than this being Marisa from Street Fighter 6. And Street Fighter isn't exactly supposed to be realistic. It's bad enough that every Western video game is filled with ugly women. Do they have to be stronger than the men, too? And look, I'll admit, there were a few games I played worse than this year, but I feel like it deserves this spot for being just generic woke slop supposedly written by Michael Kirkbride of Elder Scrolls fame. Yeah, the guy who wrote the batshit crazy parts of the Elder Scrolls lore wrote this. And of course, probably the most important reason I included this, because I streamed it for 12 hours and 40 minutes straight, from beginning to end. Truly one of my most legendarily painful streams. Fuck this game and fuck EA. Come on. Come on. Don't do that. Please. I can't handle cringe.
It's for Devin.
Oh my god, no. I can't wait to tell my brother that he shares the name with an Indian who got a hole blasted through his chest that we're supposed to care about for some reason.
Think they're here for the sea lion exhibit?
Oh, I want to see that.
Did you know sea lions can swim up to 25 miles per hour?
I wanna see the sea lion. Did you know that sea lion?
Are you fucking joking? Oh yeah, I'm gonna ruffle some feathers with this one. You knew there had to be a Sony game on the list every time one comes out. And what better choice than Spider-Man 2? Now, of course, I have to give the disclaimer, no, this is not actually the 4th worst game I played this year, but if you've been watching these best to worst games lists, you know that a game pissing me off and being disgustingly repulsive is just as important as how fun the game itself is. And it's not like Spider-Man 2 improved on the first one, gameplay-wise, like at all. No, it plays almost exactly the same. But really, my issue with this is not the gameplay. I think the gameplay is decently fun, but you already know, especially when it comes to these fucking Sony movie games, that sometimes the gameplay isn't the most important thing, especially when you're not playing the game the majority of the fucking time. This game's story was awful. It was a clusterfuck. I feel like the devs had no idea what they actually wanted to do with it. Between having 2 protagonists, Miles Morales clearly being the replacement for Spider-Man, hell, Insomniac even admitted that he's the main Spider-Man like a week after my review came out. And in Sony movie game fashion, there's plenty of walking simulator segments, and then there's the Mary Jane levels, which are all god-awful. And Mary Jane herself, look at her. She's one of the ugliest females I've seen in any video game. It's insane. People trying to say that she looks normal or average. No, she's hideous. That's a man, dude. And then, of course, there's the mini games and the brain-dead puzzles. Oh, and who could forget some of the worst side quests in gaming history? Like helping a gay kid ask his boyfriend out to prom. Or playing as Miles' deaf girlfriend spraying graffiti on walls. Or how about solving a series of light puzzles to be reminded how important BIPOC artists are to culture, or whatever the hell that fucking bullshit was supposed to be. And then maybe, just maybe, in between all of that, you'll get to play as Spider-Man for a little while. Now, of course, it is a sandbox game, so if you stop doing the story and do some side quests, you might actually have a pretty good time. But every time you do the story, it's just fucking painful. I don't want to go through it again. Even if you put aside all the woke stuff, it's just not that well written. It could have been a good game. I actually liked the first one. I have to repeat, I liked the first Insomniac Spider-Man game, but they fucked up this one. If you want to play a fun Spider-Man game, there's plenty of them out there. Play the original Spider-Man 2, play Web of Shadows, play Shattered Dimensions. Any one of those is better than this shit.
Why would the city need me when it has you?
Body in this fucking alley, and I promise you, no one is gonna miss you.
Do it. End our suffering. Do I get a Far Cry style ending where I can be like, fuck you, bitch, and then she blows my head off? That'd be excellent. She killed Luminous Studio with her freaking mind. Forspoken, a game so bad that it was almost good, actually. In a weird way, I feel bad putting this above Spider-Man 2, because I think I actually enjoyed this game more, but let's be real, this game sucks ass. If you've somehow forgotten what Forspoken is, it's essentially a westernized magical girl isekai anime. But of course in an ugly, realistic art style because it's a modern AAA game. Written by Americans, but developed by Square Enix. And because Square Enix wanted some of that sweet, sweet ESG money, our main character Frey is modeled by Ella Balinska, who parkours through the air and slings magic spells with the exaggerated swagger of a black teen. And weirdly enough, this is another game on this list where the gameplay is the most redeeming element. Now, it's not good, but it is slightly enjoyable the further you get into the game and you get more elemental magic abilities. There's cool effects all over the screen that are at least nice to look at, even if the gameplay feels a little janky. It's like an auto dodge type game. Though I will say it's another shitty open world game with a bunch of repetitive sandbox activities that you have to do over and over again, that if you cut out of the game, the story would only be 6 hours long. But other than that, the gameplay is passable, I'll say that. No, this is yet another game where all of the terrible elements are anything that's not the main gameplay. It's amazing that this shit cost $100 million to make when it really doesn't show. The character models really don't look that good. Ella Balinska is an attractive woman, I'll say it, but they clearly butchered her model. And don't even get me started on the story. I think everyone has talked shit about this story. It is one of the most unintentionally racist video games I think I've ever played. Your black female protagonist has committed larceny and been arrested several times, lives in a rundown apartment that looks like dog shit, except she has a shelf for all of her sneakers. She owes a gang a bunch of money. She's named after a fucking bridge. Her black father is nowhere to be seen at any point in the game, and her mother is white, by the way. And she's so fucking stupid that instead of grabbing all the money she stole, she grabs her cat first, who's in a different room when her apartment is burning down. And honestly, it just goes on and on. The dialogue is infamously bad. I mean, you could play any number of clips from this game, and between all of this, there's strange tonal whiplash moments, like the little girl who gets killed near the beginning of the game. I didn't see that shit coming. I don't know, this game is just the king of cringe. The biggest redeeming quality out of it is Cuff. I would have never guessed this, but he turns out to be the villain of the game, right? Which, basically everything he says is objectively correct.
Without me, you are nothing.
Most relatable villain, 2023, am I right? So I was on his team immediately, and of course, just let Frey die as soon as the boss battle started. She deserved it. No, this golden god, this 5-star man, Susurrus over here, he's the bad guy, even though all these evil bitches killed like his entire race or some shit. How is this guy not the hero? Every time with these left-wing writers, they accidentally write heroes as their antagonists. They have more relatable motivations, and oftentimes are making the morally correct decision. Even if they are evil, they're usually more likable than the protagonist. And this was one of many cases I've seen now. And so, in a weird way, I almost don't think this game belongs here, because I actually ironically enjoyed it quite a bit, but well, at the end of the day, it is a bad game, and I wouldn't recommend it to any normal person, that's for sure.
Cuff, I don't get why you...
You will never get me, Frey. How could you? You purposeless...
He is the hero. He's the
I
hero.
probably wouldn't.
He's my hero.
Nothing I do.
Yeah. Yeah. The queens. McQueen! Queen explosion. I love how in a good game, those would be like the friends you met along the way, give you their power or something. But because Frey has no friends, it's the queens that we killed throughout the game help her win. It's like, what the fuck you? That is so bad. Here, we'll see what happens when you get killed by an orc. This is the worst kind of bad game. The worst kind. It's just boring. Oh yeah, you knew Gollum was gonna be on here. This is one of those games where I already knew it was gonna be dog shit before I ever played it, but of course, people wanted to see me play a bad game, and big shock, it was a bad game. I really wish I had more to say about it, but let's be honest here, all you have to do is look at 5 minutes of gameplay to know why this thing is bad. It's buggy, it runs like shit, it looks like a PS2 game. It's a game nobody asked for. I mean, really, if you wanted to ask 100 Lord of the Rings fans what video game adaptation they'd like to see, do you think a single fucking person would say, I want a video game about Gollum's backstory? Really? And of course, worst of all, the gameplay just sucks. It's a hybrid platformer stealth game, except almost all of the platforming is like the shitty climbing fake loading screens that you see in every Sony game. So the only thing that requires any skill is the stealth, and fortunately or unfortunately, depending on how you look at it, you can just straight up run past a lot of the orcs. So there's basically nothing appealing about this game whatsoever. In a weird way, I could honestly excuse half of these problems if it wasn't so boring. But yeah, it's another one of those games that's just boring as hell, but instead of watching hours of cutscenes, everything about the game is boring except for the bugs. And so I was purposely trying to find funny shit to keep going, but even then, I could only tolerate this about 3 hours before I had to quit. So it more than deserves its spot on this list.
If I were you, I'd be running.
Maybe I don't want to run. The fact they can't even bother to have like a lava animation of some kind. Now, before we get to number 1, there are a couple of dishonorable mentions. First off, we got Avatar Frontiers of Pandora, aka Far Cry 7. Man, I really wanted to make a review of this game because my Far Cry 6 review is still the most viewed video on my channel, not including a YouTube short that blew up out of nowhere. But I just couldn't bring myself to do it. It was so unbelievably boring. I know that shouldn't be too shocking. I mean, it's an Avatar game where you're forced to play as the giant blue cats killing the humans, so I'm just vehemently against that conceptually. Even the old Avatar game that was also made by Ubisoft, back when the first movie came out, let you side with the humans and kill the blue cats. Yes, it was a bad ending, but at least you had player choice. In this game, there's like no fucking enemies anywhere, so despite using the pretty solid Far Cry gameplay loop, you're not even playing the fucking game 90% of the time. You're wandering around a giant, admittedly beautiful landscape, but there's like nothing in it. And it plays like every other fucking Far Cry or Ubisoft sandbox, whatever. You've already played this game before. The only reason you could possibly want to touch this is to play the video game version of the movie. Just fucking watch the movies again if you like the movies. Don't touch this shit. And then my other dishonorable mention I had to put on here, even though I only played it for 30 minutes, Goodbye Volcano High. This is an infamously bad game, at least for those of you who are actually aware of its existence. What's funny is, it's not even really that interesting to actually talk about. I mean, it's some cringy Tumblrina, scaly dinosaur visual novel about high schoolers in a band. You can pretty much guess the type of content you're going to see based on that. The only reason I even felt like this game was worth mentioning is because it was announced years and years ago, and some random 4chaners decided to make a fan game that was better in every single fucking way, and released for free like 2 years before this game ended up coming out. So, if anything, you should check out Snoot Game if you're into visual novel type of shit. And ignore this gross LGBT, globo, homo, modern communist art style garbage. Oh, but it turns out there was one more dishonorable mention, as I was highly encouraged to play the Rise of Kong video game that I think basically everybody shit on already, how bad it is. I did play it. Yes, it's as bad as everything you've heard. I mean, just look at the game. This is actually worse than Gollum. The only reason it didn't make the list is because, well, I think it's just too obviously shovelware. I didn't want to have 2 shovelware entries in the top 5, and I'd rather pick Gollum because at least Gollum has a bit of character to it. This is a game that literally shouldn't exist. It's just a beat 'em up where you play as King Kong, as terrible graphics, terrible level design, terrible combat, a terrible story, even though there's not much of a story at all. Pretty much everything about it is bad, but it's also not really interesting enough to talk about. What you see is what you get. You could watch 5 minutes of gameplay and know this is a complete piece of crap. So that's all I gotta say about it. And now for the absolute worst game of the year. Are you really as human as I am? I'm not convinced. Not convinced that you're as human as I am. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced. I'm not convinced. Real human being and a real hero. I'll kill you all. I'll kill you all. They took it away from me. I can't have anything. Let's be honest, are any of you even the least bit surprised? If you've watched any of my other best and worst games lists, you know the worst game of the year is always the one that represents the downfall of the video game industry. And I can't think of a better game choice than Starfield. I ranted about this game for an hour and 23 minutes, and I cut out plenty of stuff to complain about. I don't even know where to begin talking about this game again. There's just so much obviously wrong with it that it shows you that every Bethesda employee has their heads firmly shoved up their own asses. I'm tired of hearing the excuse that game developers are not complicit in the shitty art they create. It's straight up propaganda to say that game devs are just gamers like you and me and they never want to release a bad product. They think this product is good. All of the talent left Bethesda years ago now. Probably because they didn't want to make trash like this. And they got replaced by diversity hires who don't know what the fuck they're doing. They don't even play video games. They clearly don't meet the minimum standards of what's expected from a AAA game, just seeing the obviously dated graphics, the horrifically ugly NPCs, and I'm not just talking about the civilians, even a lot of the ones that give out quests look off, to say the least. This game is lacking basic features like a local area map, something that was in previous Bethesda games. How about the fact that this is a space exploration game with no exploration? I know everyone has already talked about a million times the fact that you can't actually land on a planet by flying to it, and instead you just teleport around the galaxy and then pick a random point on a planet or just follow whatever the quest marker is, and then you're inserted in a giant procedurally generated wasteland with copy-pasted places of interest. Oh, and of course, no vehicles to explore around that giant wasteland, so the game wastes hours of your time walking around empty space. And honestly, I wouldn't even be completely against the idea of randomly generating these giant spaces as long as there was a lot to actually see. I feel like they only modeled like 3 or 4 dungeons and then copy-pasted those across 1,000 planets. It doesn't make any sense. How can you think it's a good idea to have 1,000 different planets and potentially tens of thousands of randomly generated locations on those planets, but only have a template for about a dozen locations at max? And then, to make matters even worse, you're not even incentivized on any level to actually explore randomly generated planets. So again, the very concept of the game is flawed because it is pointless to explore. And that brings me to a whole other subject matter, the universe of Starfield itself. This might be the most bland sci-fi universe I've ever seen. I couldn't even tell you anything about it because it's not cohesive on any level. As we learned from Patrician TV's video, which you should probably check out, though you can be forgiven for not wanting to watch an 8-hour video on a dog shit game. But long story short, one of the major things I learned from that video is that Emil Pagliarulo, the lead writer at Bethesda, doesn't believe in design documents for video games. I don't think I need to explain why it might be a good idea for an $100 million plus project to have some kind of document to tie together your universe, the lore, gameplay concepts, any number of things, just something to coordinate the entire team to make some kind of cohesive product. That's why the world of Starfield feels so disjointed. And look, as I've said in the past, I actually defend Bethesda's style of world design, where it's kind of like a roller coaster park. I think Fallout 3 is still my favorite game of theirs. And that game has a huge number of things that don't make sense when added up together. But it was a memorable experience. Nothing in Starfield is fucking memorable, dude. I've forgotten like half the game already. And if I hadn't made a video, I'd probably have forgotten about the whole thing. It's just this bizarre mash of sci-fi concepts, whether it's the NASA punk aesthetic, which just feels like a more bland version of what Ridley Scott's Alien did decades ago, or the cyberpunk city planet, which is a city like the size of a strip mall that has no crime despite being known as like the shithole city of the universe. Oh, and you can't forget the worst nightclub ever seen in any piece of fiction. And there's a Wild West city in space. Why? Well, you saw that in Cowboy Bebop and probably several other properties at this point, so we gotta have one of those in there. The only possible way you could get any amount of enjoyment out of Starfield is just by sticking to the faction quests and the main quests, and even then, they're all dog shit. I went back and completed the Ryujin faction, and guess what? That one was dog shit too, and one of the most woke ones, with like 10 different girl bosses working for the corporation. Oh, what about the UC Vanguard questline, where you fight space deathclaws and learn that the little worms that follow humans to every planet turns out to be the Deathclaw creatures that somehow end up on every planet. Whoa, what a fucking crazy twist, dude. Oh, and we can't forget about the whole Starborn thing. Despite this being NASA punk or hard sci-fi, as some people have claimed, you have space magic powers, which are literally just shouts from Skyrim. Yeah, so much for realism. You couldn't have anthropomorphic, intelligent alien races, which I think are key to having any cool space sci-fi game, in my opinion. I know not all people share that opinion, but really, I don't give a fuck about your space sci-fi universe unless it's got intelligent aliens. And why wouldn't you want other intelligent races? Aren't Bethesda games famous for them at this point? Whether it's Elder Scrolls with the elves and the Khajiit and the Argonians, Fallout has ghouls and super mutants and even intelligent robots, but Starfield has nothing. And although I've seen like 3 or 4 other reviews of Starfield, I was one of the only people to mention that you can't kill anybody. Am I really the only guy who plays Bethesda games just testing out who's an essential NPC and who isn't? And yes, with each new release, Bethesda made more and more characters essential. I mean, probably for like the past 15 years, you haven't even been able to kill anyone related to the main quest. But to me, it just tells me how arrogant Bethesda employees are that they thought their shitty-ass, poorly written side quests were so important, so cool, that the player should not be able to fail a single one, even though the entire point of the game is another nihilistic multiverse where nothing actually matters. So why don't you at least play to one of the few benefits of that concept and allow you to kill whoever you want, at the very least in the New Game Plus runs? I argue you should be able to kill fucking anybody, because you could basically kill every character and still be able to complete the main quest in this. All you're doing is finding fucking artifacts and then going to a planet, fighting the other Starborn dickheads, and then you go to the next universe. Why is anyone even essential in this game? Again, because this is not a product made for the players. It's made for the devs and for BlackRock and for anybody but you, because they hate you. If we, the common man, are viewed as cattle by the elites, this is the type of entertainment that they want to feed us for the rest of time. And I'll admit, I did gain a tiny bit of faith in humanity when I noticed that I was far from being in the minority of people who hate this game. And I will say it one last time, this is not objectively the worst game I played this year, but it absolutely deserves to be here by being the epitome of everything I hate about modern AAA games. Now that we're done with the worst games, it's time for the best. This was by far the most difficult year for me to narrow it down to just 5 games, which you would think would be a great thing, except I realized that so many of these games were just good. not very many of them were great, amazing, excellent, or even just memorable. There were a lot of 7 out of 10s, to put it that way. And so, as usual, you can think of this as a list of recommendations. All 5 games are in different genres, and I managed to also fit in 5 honorable mentions, so this is almost like a top 10 list. So without further ado, here are the best games of 2023.
I see you have closed the gap a little. I can take no chances with you, it seems. You must face the full force of my wrath.
This is the battle you've been waiting for.
Naderia has never known a greater ruler than I. Now I will demonstrate power that you can only dream of.
Starting off, we got a niche game that I doubt most of you even know exists. Dragon Quest Monsters: The Dark Prince. If you've been around this channel for a very long time, you'll know I actually used to really love Pokemon, and I enjoy a lot of the Pokemon clones. And the Dragon Quest Monsters series is my favorite off-brand Pokemon series. It's much more similar to Shin Megami Tensei or Persona if you played those games, in the sense that the focus is not so much on capturing monsters, but on fusing them. The monsters that you recruit throughout the game with a display of strength individually are not very powerful, but you're supposed to fuse them together to make a stronger monster, and as you continue to do so, you accumulate skill points, invest those into skill trees to get more powerful skills or boost your stats, and as you fuse more and more, your monsters will rank up and have higher base stats across the board, and often higher rank monsters will come with a skill set that has better skills than the lower rank monsters. And so, in a sense, the game is kind of just a grind fest, and that's gonna put off a shit ton of people. I understand that. Me, I kind of like riding that treadmill, constantly getting more and more powerful, and eventually fusing the end game super monsters, which are final bosses from other games in the main series. Now, there are multiple huge problems with these games. First of all, the combat system is not very complex. In fact, I'd say Dragon Quest probably has the most basic JRPG combat out of every popular series. Thankfully, there's no random battles. You actually do interact with the monsters on the map, so you can just avoid battle if you want. But most of the basic fights just come down to spamming your nuclear bombs over and over again on the field, because you actually get endgame spells very early on in this game. And then the boss fights, unfortunately, are challenging in the worst way imaginable, in the sense that all of your cool debuff skills, like stunning, putting them to sleep, blinding them, most bosses are completely immune to all of those status ailments, and so it comes down to just buffing your attack and debuffing their defense. And the other major problem is that the monster fusion becomes incredibly autistic by the end game. Some could say that this is actually a positive, and I'll admit, in past games in the series, I actually like this quite a bit. But it absolutely requires playing the game with a guide, because it isn't just about fusing two specific monsters to make a stronger monster. No, there's a grandfathering system in this game. You know, instead of just having quad fusion like the Shin Megami Tensei games have, you actually have to fuse two sets of two monsters together to make unrelated monsters, and then fuse those monsters into the new super powerful monster. And you have no way of knowing this unless you use a guide. And so you may be wondering, why the hell did I put this as my 5th best game when there were plenty of great games that came out this year? Well, I'll be honest, this series is a bit of a guilty pleasure for me. I actually really like games where your numbers go up consistently, and this is one of those games. You are rewarded for the grind. It is more apparent how powerful you become by the end game than arguably any other RPG. And I'm a huge fan of Akira Toriyama's art style. A lot of people think the monsters in Dragon Quest look really goofy. I actually really like the monster designs. They range between cartoon characters drawn in a Japanese art style and straight up Dragon Ball. Another thing going for this game that I didn't expect was the story. This is an alternate timeline version of Dragon Quest IV where you're playing as the villain Pizarro, who, just like Sephiroth, is an obvious homage to Griffith from Berserk. But you actually get to be the good guy of the story. You choose good in the end, and you fight to overthrow your demon lord father and become the master of monsters. And throughout the game, you're traveling through various circles of hell that have all sorts of unique visual designs. And as someone who actually did play Dragon Quest IV, specifically the remake on DS, I appreciated all the throwbacks and the nods to the original game. Although I called this a list of game recommendations, I would really only recommend this to people who want to play another Pokemon-like game and are willing to put up with a never-ending grind. I mean, you legitimately have to enjoy the grind to enjoy this game. So if that sounds interesting to you, I'd recommend giving it a shot. Now again, if you know me and you know my taste, you knew a 3D platformer had to be on this list. And shockingly enough, I actually played 5 new 3D platformers this year. And when I was coming up with the entries for this list, I narrowed it down to 3. Either Pseudo Regalia, which definitely had the best platforming, Corn Kid 64, which had the best retro art style and general N64 feel, and this game, Cavern of Dreams. And I chose Cavern of Dreams because although it's still very much nostalgia bait for the PS1 N64 era, it also felt like a unique experience. Instead of just being a ripoff of Super Mario 64 or Spyro or Banjo-Kazooie, it also adds in some minor elements from Sonic and Ocarina of Time, of all things. The biggest thing going for this game is the movement. For some reason, the little dragon you play as can roll around like Sonic, and you can go super fast and jump huge gaps once you get some momentum going. The controls just feel great, which is important for any game, and if you ask me, if you're developing a 3D platformer, you need to have some equivalent to a run button, and that's what disqualified Corn Kid 64 for me, is that you just move too slow. And Cavern of Dreams was definitely the fastest out of the 5 3D platformers, so that's instantly a plus as somebody who likes 3D Sonic games. There's also a lot of secrets in this game, and I like exploring in 3D platformers, so that definitely enhance the experience. And like I said, there's the inspiration from Ocarina of Time in that the levels feel kind of like dungeons and there's minor puzzles in some of them. And some might view this as a negative, but it's also short and sweet. It doesn't really outlive its welcome. You can easily 100% this in 4 hours, and that's a welcome change of pace from playing all these AAA games that are like 30 hours long. Now, there are a few downsides, one of the biggest ones being that there's no enemies. This seems to be a trend in indie 3D platformers, that they just won't put enemies in the game. I have no fucking idea why. If you're perfectly fine with having hazards in the environment and some kind of failure state, why wouldn't you put enemies in too? They're obviously part of the hazards that are expected in any level. It makes the levels feel more empty than they have to be. And my final complaint's a little bit more nebulous, but this game just kind of feels incomplete. I know I said it's short but sweet, but it also feels like only half a game in a way. And this has been the case for every indie 3D platformer I've played except Hat in Time, and even that game only felt complete after the first 2 DLCs released. It seems that 3D platformers require too much manpower to create, and the genre itself is too niche, that the vast majority of indie studios would never attempt making one, and the few that do end up feeling a lot like Pseudo Regalia or Cavern of Dreams, where they're just a couple steps above a tech demo. not one of the 5 games I played met my expectations. I would still highly recommend checking out Cavern of Dreams, Pseudo Regalia, or Corn Kid 64, but just be aware that if you're a huge fan of 3D platformers like I am, all 3 of them will feel like they're missing something. Now for number 3, we've got a game I know every single one of you has heard of, the indie darling of this year, Pizza Tower. And I gotta say, unlike most really popular indie games, this game absolutely deserves its hype and its success. If somehow you don't know what this game is, it's a 2D platformer inspired by Wario Land 4, except you move faster than Sonic. And this game is just incredibly well designed for the specific niche that it's trying to hit. Now keep in mind that last part, because that's the only reason this game is not number 1, is because that niche is not for me. You guys already know I don't like speedrunning. Unfortunately, this is a speedrunning game. Now, I can give all the praise in the world to things other people have already mentioned, like the controls feel pretty much fucking perfect, the art style is amazing, the soundtrack is probably one of the best I've ever heard in any game. I'm not exaggerating. This is probably in my top 20 video game soundtracks of all time. There's a reason why I played several tracks throughout this video already. And the level design, again, for the niche it's trying to hit, is really great. But the ultimate problem with this game is that if you don't care to 100% it, meaning P ranking all of the levels, it's really not a very challenging or fulfilling game, I would argue. Which, to explain how to get a P rank, essentially every time you beat up an enemy, it starts a combo, and when you pick up collectibles and knock out other enemies, it keeps the combo going and builds it up, right? So to get the P rank, the ultimate rank for the level, you have to keep the combo going the entire time, and during the escape sequence that you get to at the end of the level and have to loop back to the beginning, you can choose to take a second lap, and this whole time a timer is going during the escape. And so likely on the second lap, you're going to run out of time, and Pizza Face is going to try and kill you, and he's the only thing that can make you restart the level. So it's this really super high risk, high reward in the sense that, you know, getting the best rank is always rewarding in any game. And this game has a really high skill ceiling and is all about memorizing levels, which, again, as someone who likes 3D Sonic games, you would think that's sort of in my niche, but honestly, this game is maybe a little too hard. Maybe my reflexes are just too slow. Either way, it is incredibly stressful. And again, as I've heard some other people say, that's when this game's gameplay loop really starts to click, is by getting those P ranks, because on its own, the levels don't have any challenge without the speed run. Like I said, Pizza Face is the only thing that can kill you, with the exception of the very last level, which has a timer going the entire time. And so if you only plan to play this game and don't care about 100%ing it, the only real challenge are the boss fights, and the boss fights are quite good as well. They're obviously inspired by Mega Man. So obviously this game still has quite a few things going for it, even if you don't care about the speedrunning aspect, but again, this is supposed to be a list of games I enjoyed the most, not the ones that were objectively the best. I have to say, this is probably the least flawed game that came out this year. So you could sort of consider it Game of the Year, but it just wasn't exactly for me, so it only gets the number 3 spot. He's gonna give me a gay scene when I haven't talked to him the whole f***ing game. That's not true. I talked to him like 4 or 5 times, but still.
That's what you get.
We've never brought him with us, not even one time. He looks autistic. He's just like reaching it. Are you seeing
You really
this?
think you're right.
I love this time of night.
Why am I that close?
Believe
Scooch away. Alright, I'll try to avoid being gay. The impossible challenge, avoid being gay in Baldur's Gate 3.
It really is.
I know some of you guys are not going to be happy to see Baldur's Gate 3 on this list, but as I've said several times since its release, this is still a good game. Yes, all of the woke shit, degenerate sexual stuff, whatever, all of that's bad. I've talked about it in detail already in the past. I wouldn't be surprised if there's a video out there that's just a compilation of all the degeneracy in the game. But the reality is, almost all of that content is completely optional. Even the stuff that's more in your face or you wouldn't really know would happen until you pick the option, like for example the bugbear and the ogre doing it in the barn, that's obviously supposed to be humorous. I didn't think it was funny, but honestly that's something that's very believable in universe and not forced, right? The only major issue I had with that degeneracy stuff, outside of attempting to normalize things that I obviously don't approve of, was your companions acting like sexual predators, specifically Gale, and thankfully that has been patched out of the game. Now obviously it's up for debate whether or not that was actually a bug, but either way the developers fixed it, and they fixed a bunch of issues with the game. The question is always, why do so many people like this game? And it's kind of hard to describe, actually. I'd say it's one of those few games that is greater than the sum of its parts. The combat might not be the best in the world, but it's also better than the vast majority of JRPGs, if we're being honest. It's just a little too fucking slow, and you can break it if you know what you're doing. But I don't even think trivializing a game through exploiting bad 5th edition mechanics is a bad thing. I'm perfectly fine with single-player games that you can break if you know what you're doing. That can be enjoyable in and of itself. The combat has a lot of unique interactivity in it that Larian is known for at this point, whether it's electrifying puddles of water or throwing a barrel full of heavy items in it to do a shit ton of damage, or turning into an owlbear and just jumping on top of somebody and killing them with your sheer mass. Pushing people off of cliffs is funny as shit, and everybody's gonna do it at least once. There's all sorts of other things, but again, the combat's just one element. One of the biggest things in this game's favor is player choice. I feel like people don't talk about this enough, but this is one of the few games where quest lines that are started in Act 1 actually have consequences all the way in Act 3, and it's consistent. Even if it's just a little nod or a reference near the end of the game, it really makes it feel like your choices actually matter. This is on top of the quite impressive character customizability, and I'm not talking about the shitty character creator, but about the character classes and subclasses. I mean, how many games can you name that have like 30 character class options to choose from at the beginning of the game? Probably just other D&D-like games. So yes, if you're like a CRPG nerd and used to a lot of this stuff, it might not seem that impressive, but again, for like a high-budget game, in this day and age, I'm shocked they didn't cut more corners here. And the sheer amount of flavor text for the class and race options throughout the game, it's crazy how many extra dialogue options they added just for roleplay purposes, even if they don't actually do anything a lot of the time, but sometimes they do act as a sort of skill check and just let you bypass one for free. Another thing is, I just like fantasy. Yes, this fantasy universe doesn't make any fucking sense. It's so pandering with all the diverse, multicultural people all living in the same area. Not even just humans of every ethnicity, but also elves, gnomes, dwarves, all being all sorts of different skin tones. It wasn't enough to have Underdark versions of these races. We also have straight-up African versions, which makes no fucking sense. But discounting all of that, this definitely feels like a genuine Dungeons & Dragons experience. I mean, you'll fight a baby beholder, mimic chests, illithids, a dragon, you know, etc., etc. There's all sorts of unique combat encounters, and there's no grinding either. An RPG with no grinding in it is extremely rare. Now, of course, there are a number of legitimate reasons why I wouldn't give this number one. First of all, the game is clearly unfinished. They talked about there being an upper city of Baldur's Gate to explore less than 3 months before the game's release, so obviously it was cut late in development. Karlach's questline has a lot of cut content. Minthara's had a lot of cut content, though apparently some of that has been patched back in. The third act in general feels rushed, and a lot of the combat encounters there are extremely annoying. It's like the developers forgot how to actually make the game challenging, and so every fight was either brain dead easy, because again, you're just exploiting game mechanics, or is very annoying because they decided to throw 30 goddamn ghosts in a house at you. And I know this is complete nerd shit, but the power scaling is completely fucked. I hate when video games fuck up power scaling. I might just be autistic growing up with DBZ, but when thieves are as powerful as an adult red dragon, that pisses me off. You're telling me you couldn't figure out a way to have a Thieves Guild be challenging other than giving them comically high player levels and classes? In fact, that's probably one of the laziest elements of the game, is that almost all the humanoid enemies you fight have character classes. It makes no sense, and it makes the player character feel less special, in my eyes. But again, I have to emphasize, especially for a high-budget game, yes, technically it's not AAA, Larian is a middleware studio, but this had an insanely high budget, especially for a CRPG, probably the highest budget any game in that genre has ever received. This game has a lot of love poured into it. It's just that people like me and my audience obviously are repulsed by a lot of that love, if you know what I'm saying. My issue, again, at the end of the day, is it seems like the vast majority of reviewers only played Act 1, which is by far the best part of the game. It only went downhill from there. It's a shame that Act 2 was basically dedicated to reuniting two lesbians, and then the third act, the villains felt like complete cartoon characters. And to me, the climax is way too over the top and simultaneously too easy by that point in the game. So, I don't know. This is one of those games I still have incredibly mixed feelings about. It's very obvious to me that this is a quality game. It could have been a masterpiece. This is one of those few times where I'll say the potential was there for this to be a 10 out of 10 game, but unfortunately, whether it's because Tencent owns part of Larian and so pushed a lot of this degenerate shit, or just the developers themselves are all fucking coomers, including the women working there, they just couldn't help but put their disgusting fetishes into the game. And again, the project was just too ambitious to the point where they couldn't properly finish and polish it all the way to the end. If they fixed those things, this would easily be Game of the Year and arguably one of the best RPGs of all time, but it's just not. So I didn't want to give it Game of the Year on this list, but it's certainly a strong second place. Die, bitch! Smite! One more smite! Yes! Yes! Numbers! Now, since I have 5 honorable mentions, I'm just going to rapid fire through them. First, we got Armored Core 6. I know a lot of people don't like my review on this game, and frankly, I do think it's a bit overrated. But as far as mech games go, I haven't played a lot, and this one was a lot of fun, incredibly fast-paced, good combat mechanics. The issue is the incredibly inconsistent difficulty, with the game being brain dead easy 90% of the time, and then the other 10%, it is incredibly difficult. Also, tank builds for the win. I will always use noob tactics to beat From Software games, and you can't stop me. Next up is Pikmin 4. I was waiting for this game for like 20 years. Yes, I know Pikmin 3 is a thing. That game doesn't count. Pikmin 4, unfortunately, was not what I wanted. It was advertised as a sequel to Pikmin 2 because it brought back treasures and dungeons with challenging monsters, except it turned out to be brain dead easy, and the real challenge was the Dandori challenges, which are glorified autistic time management simulators, all about efficiency. Well, I don't find that fun or interesting in any way. And so the game was far, far too easy unless you're trying to 100% it, but I'd be lying to you if I didn't say it was still a pretty fun game. I certainly liked it more than Pikmin 3. I probably like it about on par with the first Pikmin, but to me it just comes nowhere close to Pikmin 2. Next up, we got Lunacid, a Kingsfield-like game developed by a non-binary male, which is very unfortunate, but I gotta say, I actually had a lot of fun playing this game. It's just a classic first-person dungeon crawler type of thing, where you explore all sorts of different themed levels in this massive well. It's obviously incredibly inspired by Berserk and the Souls games, and other properties as well, almost to the point of being derivative, But the main thing going for this game is the RPG mechanics, where if you pump points into speed, you run faster. That means if you want to go fast as Sonic, it is very easy. And magic spells are actually quite varied and definitely change up your playstyle, though magic was way too overpowered and completely trivialized the difficulty of this game. That's probably the main complaint that King's Field fans had with this, is that it is far too easy. But I do still think the game has some things going for it, namely the horror element. There are a few areas in this game that are pretty spooky, and if you know the devs' other works, you'll know they're a big fan of horror. And another thing I really liked about this game was the secret endings and unlocking them. It just feels like it's missing something that would make it a complete package. And so I would still actually recommend this, as long as you're okay with an easy, kind of chill, kind of spooky game with some creative secrets and a pretty solid soundtrack as well. Next up, we got another game that very nearly made the top 5, RoboCop Rogue City. I actually ended up enjoying this quite a bit. For fans of the movies, this is absolutely a recommendation because it is clearly a love letter to the source material. My issue with this game is it's just a very basic shooter at the end of the day. There are some minor RPG mechanics. You can turn RoboCop into a fucking tank, which is fun, but the shooting is just so fucking basic. Luckily, there's gore, which does carry the satisfying gunplay, but that's pretty much all it's got going for it. It just feels too generic. I feel like I've played this game 100 times before, and it does drag out a bit too long, and RoboCop is a bit too slow, which I know he is slow as fuck, but I absolutely have a pet peeve for games where you move too fucking slow. So I couldn't quite give it a top 5 spot. In the final honorable mention, Legend of Zelda Tears of the Kingdom, because fuck you, attendees, this is a glorified $70 DLC. Was it a fun game? Absolutely. But it was the same fucking game I played 6 years ago. This is the most lazy sequel Nintendo has made since Super Mario Galaxy 2. But unlike Galaxy 2, I think this game is very flawed in quite a few ways that I don't feel like going over again. I guess you could watch my review, though I'm sure anyone annoyed by this being in the honorable mentions list is probably going to be triggered by my schizo rant. But whatever, I don't even care if there's any propaganda in it or not. That doesn't even fucking matter. What matters is this is just way too lazy for Nintendo. This is a goddamn Ubisoft sequel, but in some ways worse. It's the same fucking map as Breath of the Wild, except they added some floating islands and an underground giant wasteland. Oh my god, what a masterpiece. 10 out of 10. No, it gets an honorable mention, and you're lucky that it even gets mentioned at all. And the 2023 Game of the Year is...
You know, I could put in a word with my dad. Have you assigned to my detail, if you're interested?
No way, fam. Yes, it's going to the Resident Evil 4 remake, a game that is nearly 20 years old and inferior to the original game. Why? Because Resident Evil 4 is one of the greatest games ever made, and even a remake that is inferior is still better than any goddamn modern release. Resident Evil 4 is one of my favorite games of all time. And even though they changed a lot of stuff and they cut out some of the goofy elements and they changed the humor and the tone of the story and they ruined Salazar and Sadler's barely even in the fucking game, it still has a more fun gameplay loop than basically any game that's come out in the past 5 years. The simple satisfaction of shooting a guy in the head and then fucking roundhouse kicking him and 3 other dudes around him, or shotgunning a dude's head off, and now in this remake being able to fucking deflect thrown hatchets with your knife and then counter with a melee attack. All that shit is fun as hell. It is still fun. Now, unfortunately, I did play on hard, which gives the enemies super armor, which does make the game less fun, but it does require you to get good with the knife, which I eventually came to appreciate the more I played the game. It was frustrating at first, but I think I do agree that making the game more difficult was a good move because Resident Evil 4 is very easy. And the simple gameplay loop of killing enemies, picking up gold, using that gold to upgrade your guns, and they do noticeable more damage, right? There's a certain beauty in that simplicity. It's perfection. You don't need to change anything. There's a reason why Resident Evil 5 basically just reused all of the mechanics from 4, because there was nowhere to improve from here. I know some people hate tank controls, and that's why these remakes allow you to move while aiming. But even I didn't think there was a single problem with that back in the day, because the aim was everything. Now positioning is also a factor, and again, I don't even have a problem with that. It's a remake, it should change some things, right? What I do have an issue with is them cutting out some iconic moments from the game, like the giant bulldozer or the laser room, but speaking of that latter part, they actually brought it back in the Separate Ways DLC. And since I was already used to the changed mechanics from the main game, I actually ended up having a lot of fun with Separate Ways. And yes, in scummy Capcom fashion, they cut out something that was in the old version of the game and sold it to you for money. But this version of Separate Ways actually has more content than the original. They didn't cut out things, they actually added back in cut content from the main game, like the laser room. So honestly, I think if you haven't even played the original Resident Evil 4, this game is awesome on its own. It's unfortunate that if you're a huge fan of the original like I am, it's hard to look past all of the little changes that didn't really make much sense. But they're not all downgrades, there are some legitimate improvements. Krauser is an improvement over the original version of the character. I even think Ashley is kind of an improvement over the original. Maybe not visually, and yes, so you can't look up her skirt anymore, I know. But I definitely think she's less obnoxious in this version. At least half of the boss fights are actually better than the original game. They take more skill, they're a little less gimmicky. Some of them have more interesting cinematic attacks. And in general, they cut out all these QuickTime events and cutscenes that would kill you, which were a major issue people had with the original game. And one of the trademarks of Resident Evil 4 is the sheer variety in encounter design and the basically unmatched pacing. The game is never boring for even a second. Now, the remake does slow some things down in certain areas. Some of the cutscenes are longer, and like I said, the humor has been toned down. It's a bit more serious. But I still think the encounter design is top-notch, and the pacing is only slightly worse. We're talking about going from a 10 out of 10 game to maybe an 8.5 out of 10 game. That's probably better than anything else that releases here, except maybe Pizza Tower. So at the end of the day, I think a lot of people are going to say this is a cop-out choice, that instead of choosing an original idea, I picked an inferior version to one of my favorite games that came out almost 20 years ago. But I think this is the perfect choice for the state of the gaming industry. I am far more excited for remakes than I am for new IPs at this point. I mean, just look at the best games that released this year. Almost all of them are indie games, sequels to long-dead franchises, or remakes. I don't think there's been a genuinely great new IP from a AAA studio in like 5 years or more at this point. And no, Elden Ring doesn't count. That's basically just Dark Souls 4. Instead, we got Starfield, which is quite possibly the most dull, repetitive, safe, woke, soulless, high-budget game that has ever released. And Nintendo, of all companies, somehow managed to make a more lazy sequel than Ubisoft, and it took them 6 fucking years. And so, what did everyone pick for Game of the Year? The fucking Bear Sex Simulator. A game constantly pushing the message. And yes, it is a quality game. I wouldn't deny that for a second. But if it means not giving Game of the Year to that, then I will gladly give it to a game that came out in 2005. Resident Evil 4 has won Game of the Year again. And that was my best and worst games of 2023. I get the feeling that most of you will agree with my worst list. I'm sure plenty of you are going to have issues with the best list, though. How the hell I came to that top 5 games when probably half of the honorable mentions seem better. Well, again, it's just meant to be my taste in games, okay? I picked the 5 games that appealed to me the most. I still think all 5 of those honorable mentions are also good games. Yes, that means I'm saying Tears of the Kingdom is a good game. I did end up liking it at the end. I feel like most people didn't watch that whole video. But it is pretty sad that before this year began, it was looking like this was going to be the best year in gaming since like 2015. But unfortunately, basically every AAA release ended up being a disappointment. Now me, I don't really get hyped for any games anymore, so I wasn't exactly disappointed. But it was shocking how many of those games didn't even manage to meet my basic expectations, the worst of which being Starfield, obviously. And yet somehow people are saying that this is like the greatest year in gaming history. I don't know how you could possibly believe that. So I'm not going to end this video on like an ultra doomer note. I really do think by today's standards, this was a pretty good year. I did play more than 10 good games, which is crazy. But I honestly think I still had more fun streaming old games I'd never played before. As for next year, there's only one game I'm truly looking forward to, Dragon's Dogma 2. And so if that ends up disappointing me, look forward to the biggest doomer video you've ever fucking seen on this channel. Here's hoping 2024 doesn't disappoint. See you next time, guys.